The Dakota Territory, 1878. A diplomatic gathering ends in tragedy when the governor's niece vanishes without a trace. As tensions between settlers and native tribes threaten to explode into open conflict, the territorial government launches a desperate search. But after 3 days, with no sign of the girl, hope fades until a legendary Sioux tracker appears at the governor's doorstep offering his help. What follows is a harrowing journey through contested lands, where an unlikely alliance forms between sworn enemies, and where the truth of what happened that night proves more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated the governor's mansion as the spring evening settled over Blackwood Settlement. Inside, Governor Thomas Harrington moved from guest to guest, his hand extended in warm greeting, his smile never faltering, despite the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. This diplomatic gathering was his last hope to prevent bloodshed between the Dakota settlers and the neighboring Sioux tribes over disputed hunting grounds. At 17, Eleanor Harrington, the governor's niece and temporary ward, felt out of place among the adults and their serious conversations. She wandered to the edge of the ballroom, where the windows offered a view of the moonlit prairie beyond the settlement's borders. Her parents had sent her to live with her uncle while they traveled back east, hoping the frontier would build character in their admittedly sheltered daughter. But 2 months in the Dakota Territory had only made Eleanor long for Boston's familiar comforts. "Miss Harrington, isn't it?" A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Samuel Crawford, the son of a wealthy railroad investor. At 25, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit. Eleanor had seen him at previous gatherings, but had never spoken to him directly. "Yes," she replied, offering a polite smile, not enjoying the festivities. Crawford asked, gesturing to the crowded room. "It's all rather tense," Eleanor admitted. Crawford's expression darkened. "Your uncle is wasting his time with these negotiations. The Sioux understand only one thing: force." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. Her uncle had always spoken respectfully of the native tribes, describing them as proud people fighting to preserve their way of life. "I should return to my uncle," she said, excusing herself. As she moved through the crowd, Eleanor caught sight of William Mason, the territorial marshal, deep in conversation with her uncle. Mason's weathered face was creased with concern as he spoke in hushed tones. Governor Harrington nodded gravely before turning to address his guests. The room fell silent. "My friends," he began, "I thank you all for coming tonight. The purpose of this gathering is to build bridges between our communities. The hunting grounds west of the Blackwater River have sustained both settlers and the Sioux for generations. I believe we can find a peaceful resolution that honors the rights of all people who call this territory home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor noticed Crawford shaking his head in disapproval. "Tomorrow," the governor continued, "Chief Red Hawk and I will meet to discuss terms for sharing the disputed lands. I ask for your support in this endeavor." The gathering continued late into the night. As the clock struck 11, Eleanor felt a headache building behind her eyes. She caught her uncle's attention and motioned that she was retiring to her room. He nodded, distracted by a heated discussion with several settlement leaders. Eleanor's bedroom was in the east wing of the mansion, furthest from the noise of the gathering. As she entered, a cool breeze brushed her cheek. Odd, she didn't remember leaving the window open. The white curtains fluttered like ghostly hands in the moonlight. She moved to close the window when something caught her eye. A shadow moving across the grounds below. Eleanor leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The figure disappeared behind a stand of cottonwood trees. Probably just one of the guards, she thought, securing the latch on her window. Yet something about the furtive movement left her uneasy. Eleanor changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt, but sleep eluded her. The muffled sounds of the gathering downstairs gradually faded as guests departed. A soft tapping at her door startled her fully awake. "Eleanor," her uncle's voice was barely audible. "Are you still awake?" "Yes, come in," she called. Governor Harrington entered, looking exhausted. He sat at the edge of her bed with a weary sigh. "How did it go?" Eleanor asked. "About as well as could be expected," he replied. "Crawford and his faction are pushing for military intervention. They see the land dispute as an opportunity to drive the Sioux further west. And tomorrow's meeting with Chief Red Hawk? Our last chance for peace." He patted her hand. "But you shouldn't worry about these matters. Try to get some sleep." After her uncle left, Eleanor found herself again drawn to the window. The settlement had fallen silent, with only a few lights still burning in distant windows. The moon cast silver light across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that made her shiver. Eleanor returned to bed and finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that it would be her last night in the governor's mansion for a very long time. Dawn brought chaos to Blackwood Settlement. Governor Harrington burst into the dining room where Marshal Mason was having an early breakfast. "Eleanor is gone," he said, his voice tight with panic. Mason was on his feet instantly. "What do you mean, gone? Her bed hasn't been slept in, not since she retired last night. The window was wide open, and there are marks on the sill." The governor ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "William, she's been taken." Within the hour, Mason had assembled a search party. Trackers examined the grounds beneath Eleanor's window, finding clear evidence that someone had scaled the wall and departed with a second person, presumably Eleanor. "Boot prints head east," reported James Wilkins, the settlement's best tracker. "Two horses waiting about 100 yards out. They rode hard and fast." "Sioux?" asked Crawford, who had insisted on joining the search. Wilkins shook his head. "Can't say for sure. The prints are from Western boots, but that doesn't mean much." Governor Harrington's face had gone ashen. "The meeting with Red Hawk is in 2 hours. If word gets out that Eleanor has been abducted, the settlers will blame the Sioux," Mason finished grimly, "and any chance of peace goes up in smoke." "We need to find her before the meeting," the governor insisted. Mason organized the searchers into 3 parties to follow the trail east. Governor Harrington remained behind, torn between the search for his niece and his commitment to meet with Chief Red Hawk. Crawford pulled Mason aside before departing. "We all know who's behind this," he said in a low voice. "This is a Sioux ploy to strengthen their position in the negotiations." "We don't know anything yet," Mason replied firmly. "Stay focused on finding Eleanor, not starting a war." By midday, the search parties had lost the trail where it crossed the Blackwater River. The kidnappers had ridden through the water for at least a mile, effectively erasing their tracks. As they regrouped on the eastern bank, a messenger arrived. "From Blackwood, the governor sent me," the young man said, breathless from his hard ride. "Chief Red Hawk arrived for the meeting as scheduled." When told of Miss Harrington's disappearance, he offered his tribe's assistance in the search. Crawford scoffed. "Of course he did. A clever way to direct suspicion elsewhere." The chief seemed genuinely concerned, the messenger insisted. "He's waiting at the settlement with 20 of his warriors, ready to join the search." Mason made a quick decision. "Tell the governor we'll rendezvous back at Blackwood. We need all the help we can get." When the search party returned, they found Chief Red Hawk and Governor Harrington in deep discussion on the mansion's porch. Red Hawk was a commanding figure in his 50s, with a weathered face that spoke of decades under the Dakota sun. He wore traditional Sioux clothing, but his expression of concern transcended cultural differences. "My friend," Red Hawk said to Mason, This is a dark day, a child taken during peace talks. This violates all honor. You're certain your people had nothing to do with this? Crawford challenged. Red Hawk's gaze hardened. My warriors have been camped together for the sacred council fire. None left during the night, but there are those among both our peoples who do not want peace. Governor Harrington stepped forward. Chief Red Hawk has pledged his warriors to help find Eleanor. My best trackers will pick up the trail, Red Hawk said. We know every stream and hill in these lands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The search resumed with Sioux warriors joining the settler parties. Despite their combined efforts, the second day of searching ended in frustration. The kidnappers had chosen their route well, using rocky terrain and water crossings to obscure their trail. That night, camped on the eastern plains, tensions ran high between the settlers and Sioux. Around one campfire, Crawford voiced what many settlers were thinking. How convenient that their best trackers can't find any sign of the girl, he said to Mason. Maybe they're leading us in circles while their accomplices take her further away. That's enough, Mason replied sharply. I've known Red Hawk for 15 years. If he gave his word, I believe him. Your trust may cost Eleanor her life, and the rest of us this territory. By the third day, hope was fading. Governor Harrington looked like a man who had aged years in days. The search parties had split up to cover more ground, but no trace of Eleanor or her kidnappers had been found. As dusk approached, Mason and the governor prepared to make the difficult decision to return to Blackwood. The settlement was in turmoil, with rumors spreading that the Sioux had orchestrated the kidnapping. Some settlers were already talking about forming militias. It was then that a lone figure appeared on the horizon, approaching the governor's camp on foot. As he drew closer, even Red Hawk's stoic expression changed to one of surprise. Swift Shadow, the chief murmured. The man who walked into camp moved with the fluid grace of a predator. He appeared to be in his early 40s with copper skin, darkened by years under the sun. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, and he wore a mix of traditional Sioux clothing and frontier garb. A rifle was slung across his back, and a hunting knife hung at his side. Red Hawk stepped forward. This is Swift Shadow. Among my people, there is no better tracker. The newcomer nodded once to the governor. When he spoke, his English was perfect, with only the slightest accent. I heard a girl was taken. The trail is 3 days cold. Yes, the governor replied, hope flickering in his eyes. My niece, Eleanor. Why should we trust him? Crawford demanded. We don't even know who he is. Red Hawk's expression darkened. Swift Shadow was born James Blackwood, son of a trader and a Sioux woman. He has walked between our worlds his entire life. The tracker's dark eyes found Crawford. I have no interest in your politics or land disputes, but I won't let a child pay the price for them. Governor Harrington stepped forward. Can you find her, Mr. Blackwood? Call me Swift Shadow, the tracker replied. And yes, I can find her. But I work alone, Mason frowned. That's not practical. We have men ready to— Your men have trampled whatever trail was left, Swift Shadow cut in. I need to start fresh, from the beginning. Take me to where she was taken. As darkness fell, the governor made a difficult decision. He would return to Blackwood with most of the search party, leaving Swift Shadow to work unhindered. Before departing, he took the tracker aside. Why are you doing this? He asked. You owe nothing to me or my niece. Swift Shadow was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. A girl was taken in the night. That's reason enough. The governor nodded, understanding there was more to the story than the tracker was willing to share. Marshal Mason will accompany you back to the settlement. I don't need— He knows Eleanor, the governor insisted, and he has authority. If you encounter resistance, Swift Shadow relented. As the main search party prepared to depart, Red Hawk approached the tracker and spoke to him in the Sioux language. Mason couldn't understand the words, but he saw Swift Shadow's expression change subtly before he nodded in response. "What did he say?" Mason asked when Red Hawk had gone. "He reminded me that sometimes to find what is lost, one must be willing to lose oneself," Swift Shadow replied. "Let's go. We've wasted enough time." They reached the governor's mansion well after midnight. The settlement was quiet, with only a few guards patrolling the streets. Swift Shadow insisted on examining Eleanor's room immediately. Inside, he moved, with methodical precision, touching nothing at first, simply observing. He studied the window, the bed, the floor, noting details the previous searchers had missed. Then he knelt beside the window and examined the sill. Someone waited outside. "For hours," he said quietly. "The wood is compressed where they leaned against the wall, not the mark of a hasty abduction." He moved to the wardrobe and opened it, examining Eleanor's clothing. What was she wearing when she disappeared? "A white nightgown," Mason replied. "Swift." Shadow nodded and continued his inspection, eventually dropping to his hands and knees to study the floor near the bed. He extracted something tiny from between the floorboards with the tip of his knife. "What is it?" Mason asked. The tracker held up a small object that caught the lamplight. A shirt button, not from a woman's garment. By dawn, Swift Shadow had completed his examination of Eleanor's room and the grounds beneath her window. He moved with silent focus, stopping occasionally to study something invisible to Mason's eyes. "The previous trackers were right about one thing," he said finally. "Two horses heading east initially, but they didn't go through the river as everyone thought." "How can you know that after 3 days?" Mason asked skeptically. "Because they wanted us to think they crossed the river," Swift Shadow replied. "They laid a false trail, good enough to fool most trackers, but not me." He pointed to a nearly invisible disturbance in the soil near a clump of grass. "They doubled back here. Their actual trail heads north." Mason frowned. "North? There's nothing north but Crawford's mining operations, and then wilderness all the way to the Canadian border." Swift Shadow's expression remained impassive, precisely why it's a good direction to disappear. He straightened up. "I need supplies for a long journey. Food, ammunition, medical supplies." "For Eleanor? Let's hope she won't need them." "But yes." While Mason arranged for supplies, Swift Shadow paid a visit to the governor. He found Harrington in his study, surrounded by maps and reports, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "You found something?" the governor asked, hope and fear warring in his voice. "I know which way they went," Swift Shadow replied. "North, not east." The governor's brow furrowed. "North? But the search parties, we're following a false trail." The tracker hesitated before continuing. "Governor, I need to ask you something. Who benefits most from your peace talks failing?" Harrington sank into his chair. "There are factions on both sides who prefer conflict to compromise. Some settlers want the Sioux removed entirely from the territory, and there are young warriors who believe fighting is the only way to protect their lands. And among your settlers, who gains the most if the Sioux are pushed out?" The governor's eyes narrowed. "Crawford's mining company has been surveying the disputed lands for months. He claims there are rich silver deposits there." Swift Shadow nodded slowly. "One more question. This button..." He produced the small object he'd found in Eleanor's room. "Would it match Crawford's shirts?" The governor stared at the button, then at the tracker. "You think Samuel Crawford is behind this?" "I think," Swift Shadow replied carefully, "that a man who spoke against peace at your gathering may have decided to ensure those talks fail." When Mason returned with supplies, Swift Shadow was ready to depart. He had exchanged his rifle for a Winchester repeater from the governor's armory and carried only what was essential for the journey. "The governor told me your suspicions about Crawford," Mason said as they mounted their horses. "They're just suspicions until we find proof," Swift Shadow replied. "But we need to move quickly. Crawford left the settlement this morning, supposedly to check on his mining operation." Mason's expression hardened. "If he's harmed Eleanor, save your anger for when we need it," the tracker advised. "For now, we follow the trail." As they rode north out of Blackwood, the sun climbed higher in the sky, promising another scorching day on the Dakota plains. Swift Shadow led them on a winding path, stopping occasionally to confirm signs that remained invisible to Mason. "How did you become such a skilled tracker?" Mason asked during one such stop. Swift Shadow knelt beside a patch of trampled grass. "My Sioux grandfather began teaching me when I could barely walk. Later I tracked for the army during the war." "You fought for the Union?" "I scouted for them," the tracker corrected. "I saw enough killing to last many lifetimes." They rode in silence after that, each man lost in his own thoughts. By midday they had covered nearly 20 miles, the landscape changing from open prairie to rolling hills, studded with stands of cottonwood and oak. Swift Shadow reined in suddenly, studying the ground with intense concentration. He dismounted and crouched low, examining something in the dirt. They stopped. "Here briefly," he said. 3 days ago." "3? I thought there were only 2 kidnappers." The tracker pointed to barely perceptible depressions in the soil. "2 men took her from the mansion. They met a 3rd person here." He looked up at Mason. "A woman." "A woman?" Mason repeated in disbelief. "Are you certain?" Swift Shadow stood. "The boot print is smaller, the stride shorter, and this—" He held up a thread so fine it was nearly invisible. "From a woman's garment, blue silk." "Crawford's sister wears blue," Mason said slowly. "Jessica Crawford returned from finishing school in Europe last month." Swift Shadow remounted his horse. "The trail leads toward that ridge. We can reach it by nightfall." As they continued north, the signs of passage became clearer to Swift Shadow's experienced eyes. The kidnappers, believing their false trail had worked, had grown less cautious. "They're not professionals," he remarked. "They make mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" Mason asked. "They don't cover their campsite properly. They leave behind small items." He produced a handkerchief from his pocket. "Like this. Found it near where they stopped for water yesterday." Mason took the delicate piece of fabric. An embroidered JC adorned one corner. "Jessica Crawford," he muttered. "But why would she be involved in kidnapping Eleanor?" Swift Shadow's expression remained unreadable. "People have many reasons for doing terrible things. Greed, jealousy, revenge. Revenge against the governor," the tracker urged his horse forward, "or against Eleanor herself." As dusk approached, they reached the ridge Swift Shadow had identified. From its summit, they could see the sprawling operation of Crawford Mining. Company in the valley below. Dozens of tents surrounded a main building, with men moving about like ants around the entrance to the mine shaft. "They wouldn't take her there," Mason said. "Too many witnesses." Swift Shadow pointed to a small cabin, set apart from the main camp, nestled against the tree line. "There, that's where the trail leads." They tethered their horses in a grove of trees and approached on foot as darkness fell. Lights burned in the cabin windows and smoke curled from the chimney. "Wait here," Swift Shadow instructed, melting into the shadows before Mason could protest. The tracker moved silently toward the cabin, becoming one with the gathering darkness. As he neared, voices drifted through an open window. "It wasn't supposed to take this long." A woman's voice, tense with anger. "The plan is working perfectly." Samuel Crawford's smooth tones. "By now, the settlement is convinced the Sioux took her. The governor's peace talks are in ruins." "And what about her?" the woman demanded. "We should have left her in the wilderness as we planned." 3 days, Samuel. She could identify us." "Patience, Jessica. Once the militia attacks the Sioux camp, no one will care about the governor's niece. They'll be too busy fighting a war." Then we can deal with her permanently." Swift Shadow had heard enough. He circled back to where Mason waited, his face grim. "They have her," he confirmed in a whisper. "Crawford and his sister. They staged the kidnapping to provoke war between settlers and the Sioux." Mason's hand went to his pistol. "We need to get Eleanor out of there. Now." "There are at least 3 armed men inside, possibly more," Swift Shadow cautioned. "We need a plan." As they crouched in the darkness, formulating their strategy, neither man noticed the rider departing from the far side of the cabin, racing toward the mining camp with urgent news. The final confrontation was rapidly approaching, and Eleanor's fate, along with the peace of the entire territory, hung in the balance. In the darkness outside Crawford's cabin, Swift Shadow and Marshal Mason finalized their approach. The tracker had circled the structure twice more, confirming 3 armed men inside, besides Crawford and his sister. Eleanor was being held in a back room, likely bound. "I can create a distraction at the front," Swift Shadow whispered. "Draw their attention while you enter through the rear window." Mason nodded grimly. "What kind of distraction?" The tracker pulled a small leather pouch from his belt. "Something my Sioux grandfather taught me. When it starts, wait 30 seconds, then move." Swift Shadow disappeared into the night. Mason counted the seconds, his hand on his revolver, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Then came the distraction. A series of shrill, inhuman screams pierced the night, seemingly coming from all directions at once. The cabin door burst open, and 2 armed men rushed out, rifles ready. From inside, Mason heard Crawford shouting, "Orders! Check the perimeter! It could be Sioux! 30 seconds!" Mason crept to the back of the cabin. The small window was unlatched, Swift Shadow's handiwork. He eased it open and pulled himself through, landing quietly on the wooden floor of what appeared to be a storeroom. A kerosene lamp burned low in the main room. Through the partially open door, Mason saw Crawford pacing nervously while his sister, Jessica, stood by the fireplace, a pistol gripped in her trembling hand. "It's a trick," she hissed. "Someone followed us." "Impossible," Crawford snapped. "No one could have tracked us here." Mason drew his revolver and took a deep breath. He had one chance to do this right. Bursting through the door, he leveled his weapon at Crawford. "Marshal Mason," Crawford said, recovering quickly from his surprise. "This is unexpected." "Step away from the fireplace, Miss Crawford," Mason ordered. "Put the gun down. Where's Eleanor?" Jessica's lips curled in contempt, but she placed her pistol on the mantel. "This isn't what it looks like, Marshal," Crawford said smoothly. "We rescued the girl from Sioux raiders. We've been keeping her safe until—" "Save it, Crawford. We heard everything." Mason kept his revolver trained on Crawford's chest. "Now where is she?" A floorboard creaked behind him. Mason realized his mistake too late. He'd forgotten to check the entire storeroom. Pain exploded at the base of his skull, and darkness claimed him. When Mason regained consciousness, his hands were bound behind his back. He was propped against a wall, head throbbing. Crawford stood over him, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "I'm genuinely sorry about this, Marshal," Crawford said. "You're a good man who chose the wrong side." Mason tested his bonds. Tight. "The governor knows where I am. He'll send men." Crawford laughed. "By the time anyone comes looking, the territory will be at war. The Sioux will be blamed for both Eleanor's disappearance and your unfortunate death." "Where's Swift Shadow?" Mason demanded. "The half-breed tracker?" Crawford's expression darkened. "My men are hunting him now. He won't escape." A gunshot echoed from outside, followed by a scream. Crawford rushed to the window. 2 more shots rang out. In quick succession. "Edwards, Reynolds," Crawford called. No response came. "Sounds like your men found him," Mason said, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from his voice. Crawford grabbed a rifle from the wall. "Jessica, stay with the prisoners. Shoot the marshal if he tries anything." He hurried out the door as he The door closed behind Crawford. Jessica turned to Mason, her eyes cold. "You've ruined everything." "Where's Eleanor?" Mason asked. Jessica nodded toward a closed door across the room. "She's alive, for now." Outside, more gunshots punctuated the night. Jessica moved nervously to the window, trying to see what was happening. The moment her back was turned, the storeroom door eased open silently. Swift Shadow slipped into the room, a hunting knife gleaming in his hand. In one fluid motion, he was behind Jessica. She gasped as the cold steel pressed against her throat. "Drop the gun," he commanded quietly. The pistol clattered to the floor. Swift Shadow pushed her into a chair and quickly bound her wrists with a length of rope. "Crawford's men?" Mason asked as the tracker cut his bonds. "Won't be a problem," Swift Shadow replied. "Crawford ran toward the mining camp. He'll be back with reinforcements soon." Mason rubbed his wrists, wincing. "Eleanor!" They crossed to the closed door. It was locked from the outside. Swift Shadow slid the bolt and opened it to reveal a small bedroom. Eleanor Harrington lay on a narrow bed, her wrists and ankles bound, a gag in her mouth. Her eyes widened at the sight of them. Mason quickly removed the gag while Swift Shadow cut her bonds. "Marshal Mason," she gasped. "How did you find me?" "Thank him." Mason nodded toward Swift Shadow, best tracker in the territory. Eleanor studied the half-Sioux man with wonder. "My uncle sent you?" "Questions later," Swift Shadow replied, helping her to her feet. "We need to move before Crawford returns." Eleanor stood shakily. 3 days of captivity had left her weak but determined. "They're planning to attack the Sioux camp," she said urgently. "Crawford has men riding to Blackwood right now with proof that I was seen at the Sioux camp." "What proof?" Mason asked. "My locket. They're going to plant it in Chief Red Hawk's tent." Swift Shadow's expression hardened. "We need to split up. Marshal, take Eleanor back to Blackwood. Ride hard and don't stop. I'll deal with Crawford." "You can't face him and his men alone," Mason protested. "I won't be alone," Swift Shadow replied, cryptically. "Now go!" Jessica Crawford watched them from her chair, seething with anger. "You'll never make it back in time," she spat. "Samuel's messenger left hours ago." Swift Shadow approached her, his expression unreadable. "Why did you do this?" The girl was innocent. Jessica's chin lifted defiantly. "The Harringtons have always looked down on our family. Thomas Harrington blocked my father's mining claims for years. When Samuel discovered silver in the disputed territory, we saw our chance for revenge and wealth in one stroke. By starting a war, by claiming what's rightfully ours," she retorted. "The Sioux are savages who don't deserve." Swift Shadow turned away, cutting off her diatribe. "Take their horses," he told Mason. "They're fresher than ours." Minutes later, Mason and Eleanor were mounted and ready to depart. The marshal gave Swift Shadow a troubled look. "What are you planning?" "To stop a war," the tracker replied simply. "Go!" As Mason and Eleanor disappeared into the night, Swift Shadow returned to the cabin. Jessica still sat bound to the chair, glaring at him. "What are you going to do with me?" she demanded. "Nothing," he replied, gathering supplies from around the cabin. "But you should be gone before your brother returns. He'll need someone to blame for this failure." He left her bound but placed a knife just out of reach on the floor. A challenge that would take her time to overcome. By the time she freed herself, he would be long gone. Swift Shadow rode north, pushing his horse hard. The moon illuminated the trail before him, but he didn't need light to find his way. He had ridden these lands since childhood. After an hour, he reached a ridge overlooking a secluded valley. Below, campfires dotted the darkness, a Sioux hunting camp separated from the main tribe during the seasonal buffalo hunt. He descended quickly, calling out in the Sioux language as he approached. Warriors emerged from their teepees, weapons ready. Until they recognized him, Swift Shadow, an elder named Running Bear, greeted him. "What brings you here at night?" "Trouble comes," Swift Shadow replied grimly. "Crawford plans to attack Chief Red Hawk's camp. he seeks to blame the Sioux for kidnapping the governor's niece. The warriors gathered around as Swift Shadow explained the situation. When he finished, Running Bear nodded solemnly. "We will ride with you, brother. How many men does this Crawford have?" 20, perhaps 30, at the mining camp. More if his messenger reaches Blackwood. Running Bear turned to his warriors. "Prepare to ride. We leave in 10 minutes." By dawn, Swift Shadow and 15 Sioux warriors were positioned along the trail between Crawford's mining operation and the main Sioux encampment. They didn't wait long. The sound of approaching horses reached them just as the first light of day crested the eastern hills. Crawford led a column of 20 armed men, riding hard toward the Sioux territory. Swift Shadow signaled, and the warriors melted into the landscape, invisible among the rocks and trees flanking the trail. When Crawford's group reached the center of the ambush zone, Swift Shadow stepped into the open, alone and seemingly unarmed. Crawford reined his horse sharply. "The half-breed," he snarled. "Where are the marshal and my sister?" "Gone," Swift Shadow replied calmly. "Like your plan, Crawford." Crawford raised his rifle. "One man can't stop us." "He's not alone," came Running Bear's voice as the Sioux warriors emerged from hiding, arrows nocked, rifles aimed. Crawford's men shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were surrounded. "Lower your weapons," Swift Shadow advised. "No one needs to die today." For a tense moment, it seemed Crawford might order his men to fight. Then, calculating the odds, he slowly lowered his rifle. "This changes nothing," he said bitterly. "The settlement will still blame the Sioux for the girl's disappearance. Eleanor is riding to Blackwood with Marshal Mason," Swift Shadow informed him. "By now, they've likely reached the governor. Your messenger won't be believed." Crawford's face contorted with rage. "You've ruined everything." "Your sister said the same thing," Swift Shadow replied. "She's probably halfway to the Canadian border by now, if she's wise." Under the watchful eyes of the Sioux warriors, Crawford and his men were disarmed. Running Bear dispatched 2 riders to warn Chief Redhawk of the plot against him. "What now?" Crawford demanded. "You can't hold us here forever." "No," Swift Shadow agreed. "Just long enough for justice to find you." Meanwhile, Marshal Mason and Eleanor had indeed reached Blackwood settlement. They arrived exhausted just after midnight, their borrowed horses lathered and heaving. Governor Harrington was awakened immediately, his joy at seeing his niece safe overwhelming him momentarily. But there was no time for celebration. After quickly explaining Crawford's plot, Mason organized a company of deputies to ride out and intercept Crawford's messenger before he could reach the Sioux camp with Eleanor's planted locket. "We caught him just before dawn," Mason later recounted to the governor and Eleanor, who had recovered somewhat after a few hours' rest. "The locket was in his saddlebag, just as you said." Governor Harrington shook his head in disbelief. "And Crawford planned to use this to provoke an attack on the Sioux? With the settlement already on edge, it wouldn't have taken much," Mason confirmed. "Just the suggestion that the Sioux had harmed Eleanor." "Where is Samuel Crawford now?" Eleanor asked quietly. Mason glanced out the window toward the eastern horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise. "If Swift Shadow's plan worked, he should be arriving under guard any time now." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose. From the direction of the main street, they moved to the window to see a remarkable procession entering Blackwood. Swift Shadow rode at the front alongside Running Bear. Behind them came Crawford and his men, disarmed and on foot, surrounded by Sioux warriors on horseback. The citizens of Blackwood emerged from their homes and businesses to witness the spectacle. As the procession reached the center of town, Swift Shadow dismounted and approached the governor's mansion. Governor Harrington met him on the porch. "Mr. Blackwood," he said formally, extending his hand, "it seems the territory owes you a great debt." Swift Shadow accepted the handshake with a slight nod. "The debt is to Running Bear and his warriors," he replied. They prevented bloodshed when they could have sought revenge. Running Bear joined them, his dignified presence commanding respect even among the wary settlers. "Chief Redhawk will be pleased to hear of these events," the Sioux elder said. "Perhaps now the peace talks can continue without interference." Crawford, standing under guard nearby, glared at them with undisguised hatred. "This territory will never know peace," he spat. "The settlers won't stand for it." "That's not for you to decide anymore," Governor Harrington replied coldly. He turned to Marshal Mason. "Take Mr. Crawford and his men into custody. The territorial court will convene next week to hear charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder." As Crawford was led away, Eleanor approached Swift Shadow. The young woman had changed in the days since her abduction. There was a new strength in her bearing, a resilience born of hardship overcome. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding me when the trail was cold." Swift Shadow studied her for a moment. "No trail is ever truly cold," he replied. "Not if you know how to read the signs," Governor Harrington rejoined them. "Mr. Blackwood, I'd like to offer you a position as Special Marshal for the territory. We need men who can bridge the divide between our peoples." Swift Shadow shook his head. "I walk my own path, Governor, but I'll remain nearby while the peace talks continue." Running Bear stepped forward. "Chief Redhawk asked that Swift Shadow serve as his advisor during the negotiations. He trusts his judgment." The governor nodded thoughtfully. "That seems an excellent arrangement." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Blackwood settlement, an unlikely gathering formed on the governor's porch. A territorial official, a half-Sioux tracker, a Sioux elder, a frontier marshal, and a Boston-bred young woman whose ordeal had nearly sparked a war. Each represented different worlds, different traditions, but in that moment they stood united by a common purpose. The next day, Chief Redhawk arrived for the rescheduled peace talks. News of Crawford's plot and Swift Shadow's role in uncovering it had spread throughout the territory. When the Sioux chief entered the governor's mansion, he was greeted with respect by settlers who days earlier had suspected him of kidnapping. Eleanor insisted on attending the negotiations. She had given her formal testimony against Crawford and his sister, who remained at large, but felt her presence at the peace talks was equally important. "The disputed lands have been stained with blood many times," Chief Redhawk said as the talks began. "Let us ensure they are not stained again because of greed or hatred." Governor Harrington nodded solemnly. "We have seen how easily peace can be threatened, but we have also seen how it can be preserved through understanding and cooperation." Swift Shadow, seated slightly behind Chief Redhawk, remained silent throughout most of the proceedings. His role was not to speak, but to observe, to ensure that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt on firmer foundations. The negotiations continued for 3 days. In the end, a compromise was reached. The hunting grounds west of the Blackwater River would remain open to both settlers and Sioux, with strict limitations on mining and development. A joint council, consisting of representatives from both communities, would oversee the shared territory. On the final evening, as the formal agreement was signed, Swift Shadow slipped away from the gathering. His work was done. He preferred the solitude of the prairie to the constraints of settlements, whether Sioux or white. Eleanor found him by the stables, preparing his horse for departure. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" she asked. Swift Shadow secured his saddle before turning to face her. "I'm not good at goodbyes." "Where will you go?" He gestured vaguely westward. "There's always somewhere that needs finding." Eleanor hesitated, then spoke with the directness of someone who had faced death and emerged stronger. "My uncle says the territorial government is establishing a ranger service to patrol the shared lands. They need men who understand both worlds." A slight smile touched Swift Shadow's usually impassive features. "Are you offering me a job, Miss Harrington?" "I'm suggesting a purpose," she replied. one that might keep you nearby. Swift Shadow mounted, his horse considering her words. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's not a no," Eleanor observed. "No," he agreed, "it's not." As Swift Shadow rode out of Blackwood Settlement, the setting sun painted the prairie in hues of gold and amber. Behind him, an unlikely peace had begun to take root. Before him stretched the endless horizon, promising both solitude and possibility. He would return. The half-Sioux tracker who walked between worlds had found something unexpected in this territory, torn by conflict, a place where his unique skills and perspective were valued, where the differences that had once made him an outsider might help build bridges rather than walls. For now, though, the open prairie called to him. Swift Shadow urged his horse forward, riding into the gathering dusk, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vastness of the Dakota sky. Back in Blackwood, Eleanor watched him disappear into the distance. She touched the locket around her neck, the one Crawford had planned to use to ignite a war, now restored to its rightful owner. Inside was a small portrait of her parents, a reminder of the Boston life that now seemed a world away. She closed the locket and turned back toward the governor's mansion, where the lamplight spilled warmly from the windows. The frontier had indeed built character in her, though not in the way her parents had intended. The Dakota Territory had shown her both the darkness in men's hearts and the courage required to stand against it. As for Swift Shadow, Eleanor had no doubt their paths would cross again. Some trails, once found, were never truly lost. 1 month after the peace accord was signed, the Dakota Territory experienced an uneasy calm. The Joint Council overseeing the shared hunting grounds had convened twice, with representatives from both the settlement and the Sioux Nation working through initial disagreements with surprising cooperation. Samuel Crawford awaited trial in the territorial prison, his mining operation shut down pending investigation of illegal claims. His sister Jessica remained at large, reportedly seen crossing into Canada with a substantial amount of her family's wealth. At the governor's mansion, Eleanor Harrington sat at her writing desk, penning a letter to her parents in Boston. The afternoon sun streamed through the open window, carrying with it the scent of prairie wildflowers. "Dear Mother and Father, I trust this letter finds you well. Uncle Thomas sends his regards and assures me that your business in Boston proceeds satisfactorily. You asked about my return journey east. While I appreciate your concern, I must inform you that I have decided to remain in the Dakota Territory for the foreseeable future. The events of the past month have shown me that I have a purpose here. Uncle Thomas has appointed me as his assistant for correspondence with the Sioux Council representatives. My experience, however unfortunate, has given me insight that proves valuable to the ongoing peace process. I am no longer the sheltered girl you sent west to build character. The frontier has indeed changed me, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipated." A knock at her door interrupted her writing. She looked up to see her uncle standing in the doorway, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, setting down her pen. "Marshal Mason has returned from Fort Lincoln," Governor Harrington replied. "There's been a development regarding Crawford." Eleanor followed her uncle to his study, where Mason waited, trail dust still clinging to his clothing. The marshal nodded a greeting, his weathered face gravely. "Crawford escaped during prisoner transfer," he announced without preamble. "Killed 2 guards." The governor sank into his chair. "How? When?" 3 days ago. A group of riders ambushed the transfer wagon near Split Rock Canyon. Professional job, quick and precise." Mason glanced at Eleanor. "We found this pinned to one of the dead guards." He placed a folded paper on the desk. Governor Harrington opened it and read aloud. "A debt will be paid in full. The half-breed tracker first, then the girl, then the peace." Eleanor felt a chill, despite the warm day. "Jessica," she said quietly, "she's helped him escape." Mason nodded. That's our thinking. Witnesses at the last trading post before the canyon reported seeing a woman matching her description meeting with 3 men the day before. Have you warned Swift Shadow? Eleanor asked. We've sent riders to find him, but Mason spread his hands helplessly. He's been ranging far to the west these past weeks. Hard to track a man who doesn't want to be found. Governor Harrington stood and paced to the window, gazing out at the settlement below. We need to strengthen security immediately. Eleanor must be protected at all costs. I've already doubled the patrol around Blackwood, Mason assured him. But Crawford knows the territory almost as well as Swift Shadow. He could approach from any direction. What about Chief Red Hawk? Eleanor asked. He should be warned. If Crawford wants to destroy the peace agreement, I dispatched a messenger to the Sioux camp this morning, Mason confirmed. Red Hawk will be on alert. The governor turned back from the window, his decision made. Eleanor, I want you to leave for St. Louis on tomorrow's stage. You'll be safer there until Crawford is recaptured. Eleanor rose from her chair. No. This isn't a request. Her uncle replied firmly. Crawford has threatened you directly. And if I run, he wins, Eleanor countered. This peace is fragile, Uncle. My presence here symbolizes the commitment to maintain it. If I flee at the first sign of trouble, what message does that send to the Sioux? Mason watched the exchange with a thoughtful expression. She has a point, Governor. Crawford wants to create fear, to show that our words of peace are empty. Governor Harrington sighed heavily. Then we increase security further. You don't leave the settlement without an armed escort, no exceptions. Eleanor nodded, accepting the compromise. Has anyone checked Crawford's mining camp? He might return there. First place we looked, Mason replied. Abandoned. But we found plans, detailed surveys of silver deposits throughout the disputed territory. Crawford wasn't just after one claim. He wanted the entire region. As dusk fell over Blackwood settlement, 50 miles to the northwest, Swift Shadow made camp in a sheltered ravine. He had spent the past weeks exploring the far boundaries of the shared territory, mapping routes that could be used by the new ranger service Eleanor had mentioned. The solitude suited him. After the intensity of the peace negotiations, he needed time alone to reconnect with the land. Yet thoughts of Blackwood and of Eleanor Harrington intruded on his contemplation more often than he cared to admit. He was banking his small campfire when an owl call sounded from the ridge above. Except, no owl made that particular sequence of notes. Swift Shadow reached casually for his rifle, keeping his movements unhurried. You might as well show yourself, he called. Your owl needs practice. A low chuckle came from the darkness, and a figure emerged from behind a boulder. The Sioux warrior. Wolf Eyes was Swift Shadow's age, with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jawline, a childhood injury they had acquired together on a foolhardy hunting expedition. Your hearing is still sharp, brother, Wolf Eyes said in the Sioux language as he approached the fire, and your owl call is still terrible, Swift Shadow replied in kind, embracing his childhood friend. What brings you so far from the camp? Wolf Eyes' expression turned serious. Red Hawk sent me to find you. The white man Crawford has escaped. He seeks revenge against you and the governor's niece. Swift Shadow absorbed this news silently, pouring coffee for his friend. When? 3 days ago. The marshal sent a warning to our camp. Swift Shadow nodded, calculating distances in his mind. Crawford will go to ground somewhere familiar, gathering strength before he strikes. There is more, Wolf Eyes continued. 2 hunters from our tribe disappeared near the old burial grounds. They were found yesterday, killed in the way of white men, but arranged in the manner of Sioux death rituals. Swift Shadow's eyes narrowed. Crawford is trying to provoke conflict. Again, Some young warriors already call for revenge. Red Hawk holds them back, but their anger grows. Swift Shadow doused his fire and began packing his few possessions. We ride for Blackwood at first light. Crawford will strike there next, at Eleanor. Wolf Eyes studied his friend with interest. You speak the girl's name with concern. She was under my protection, Swift Shadow replied simply. And now? Now she is still in danger. He secured his bedroll behind his saddle. Get some rest. We have a hard ride ahead. The next morning it dawned clear and cool. Swift Shadow and Wolf Eyes had covered nearly 20 miles before the sun reached its zenith. They paused at a creek to rest their horses and eat a sparse meal of dried venison. Crawford's sister, Swift Shadow said, breaking their companionable silence. The settlers believe she helped him escape. Wolf Eyes nodded. The woman with hair, like autumn grass. I saw her at the trading post 2 weeks ago. She spoke with men who were not settlers or traders. Hired guns, Swift Shadow concluded. How many? 4, perhaps 5. They carried weapons of soldiers but had eyes of killers. Swift Shadow filled his canteen from the creek. Crawford is planning something bigger than revenge. The peace agreement stripped him of his mining claims, but the land still holds silver. You think he will try to retake the mines? I think, Swift Shadow replied carefully, that a man willing to kidnap an innocent girl and blame it on the Sioux to start a war won't stop until he gets what he wants, or until someone stops him permanently. They remounted and continued south toward Blackwood. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of the disputed territory, where the prairie gave way to the rolling wooded hills surrounding the settlement. Swift Shadow reined in suddenly, his practiced eye catching what others would miss, a single bootprint in a patch of soft earth, fresh enough that its edges remained sharp. Wolf Eyes dismounted beside him. Someone passed here recently. Swift Shadow examined the surrounding area, 3 riders moving parallel to the main trail, trying to avoid being seen. Crawford. One set of prints matches the boots he wore at the mining camp. Swift Shadow. Remounted. They're heading for Blackwood, but not by the direct route. The 2 men urged their horses forward, following the hidden trail with increasing urgency. As twilight approached, they created a ridge that offered a view of Blackwood. Settlement in the valley below. Lights twinkled in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared evening meals. Swift Shadow studied the peaceful scene with unease. Something's wrong. The patrol mason established should be visible on the outskirts. Wolf Eyes pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from the trees east of town. That is not a cooking fire. They rode hard down the ridge, keeping to the cover of the trees. As they neared the source of the smoke, Swift Shadow dismounted and signaled for Wolf Eyes to do the same. They approached on foot, moving silently through the underbrush. In a small clearing lay the answer to Swift Shadow's concern. 3 of Mason's deputies sprawled motionless on the ground, their horses gone. One man's hand still gripped his revolver. Never fired. Throats cut, Wolf Eyes observed grimly. Silent killing. Swift Shadow knelt beside one of the men, noting the precision of the fatal wound. Professional work. They never had a chance to sound an alarm. The settlement is unprotected, Wolf Eyes said. Not entirely. Swift Shadow checked his Winchester. Mason will have men in town, but Crawford now has a way in without being seen. They left the horses hidden and continued toward Blackwood on foot, using the growing darkness as cover. As they reached the edge of town, Swift Shadow paused to survey the situation. The settlement appeared normal. People moving between buildings, the saloon alive with light and the sound of a piano. Nothing seemed amiss, yet Swift Shadow's instincts told him the danger was imminent. We need to get to the governor's mansion, he murmured. That's where Crawford will strike. They kept to the shadows, avoiding the main street. Swift Shadow led them through back alleys and between buildings. As they approached the mansion, he noted the absence of guards at the front entrance. Too easy, he whispered to Wolf Eyes. It's a trap. A woman's scream suddenly pierced the evening calm, coming from inside the mansion. Swift Shadow recognized Eleanor's voice. Caution forgotten, he sprinted toward the building, Wolf Eyes close behind. They burst through the front door to find the foyer empty, though a lamp had been overturned, its oil spreading across the polished floor. Swift Shadow signaled for Wolf Eyes to check the rear of the house while he took the stairs 2 at a time. At the top of the staircase, a body lay crumpled against the wall, one of Mason's deputies, a bullet hole in his forehead. Swift Shadow moved past him toward the sound of voices coming from the governor's study. "Won't work, Crawford," Governor Harrington was saying, his voice strained but defiant. "The peace agreement is already ratified by the territorial authority." "Agreements can be undone," came Crawford's cold reply, "especially when Sioux warriors massacre a settlement." Swift Shadow reached the partially open door of the study. Through the gap, he could see Governor Harrington seated behind his desk. A bruise darkening his left cheek, Crawford stood before him, a revolver in hand. 2 armed men flanked the governor, while a third held Eleanor by the arm. Jessica Crawford perched on the edge of the desk, dressed in men's clothing, her red hair tied back severely. "Sign the documents, Governor," she said. "Transfer the mining, rights back to our family, and you might survive the night." "Even if I signed," the governor replied, "the Joint Council would never—" "The council won't exist after tonight," Crawford cut in. "My men are already in position throughout Blackwood. On my signal, they'll begin shooting, making it appear that Sioux warriors are attacking the settlement." Eleanor struggled against her captor's grip. "No one will believe that after what happened before. They will when they find evidence of your uncle's secret negotiations with Red Hawk," Jessica replied smugly. "Documents showing he planned to cede the entire territory to the Sioux in exchange for personal gain." "Forged documents," Eleanor spat. "Details," Jessica waved dismissively. "The bodies will be real enough." Swift Shadow had heard enough. He signaled down the hallway where Wolf Eyes had appeared silently from the rear staircase. With quick hand motions, he outlined his plan. Inside the study, Crawford checked his pocket watch. "Time's up, Governor. Your signature or your niece. Dies first, then you." Governor Harrington's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Give me the papers." As Jessica triumphantly slid documents across the desk, the window behind the governor shattered. Wolf Eyes rolled into the room, 2 knives flashing. In his hands, the first buried itself in the chest of the man holding Eleanor. The second struck the gunman to the governor's right. In the moment of shock that followed, Swift Shadow kicked open the door and fired his Winchester. The third gunman fell before he could raise his weapon. Crawford dove behind a high-backed chair as Jessica scrambled for cover. "Get down!" Swift Shadow shouted to Eleanor and the governor. Crawford emerged from behind the chair, firing rapidly. Swift Shadow felt the burn of a bullet grazing his arm, but kept his focus on Crawford. He fired twice more, forcing Crawford back into cover. Wolf Eyes had engaged the surviving gunman in hand-to-hand combat, the 2 men locked in a desperate struggle near the broken window. Eleanor pulled her uncle beneath the heavy oak desk as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass around them. "The half-breed tracker?" Crawford called from his position. "Right on time. I was counting on your predictability." Swift Shadow moved silently along the wall, using the shadows to conceal his position. "Surrender, Crawford. Your plan has failed." Crawford laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Has it? My men throughout town have heard the gunfire by now. The signal to begin the attack." A sudden explosion rocked the settlement, its orange glow visible through the study window. Then another, closer. "That would be the marshal's office," Jessica announced with satisfaction, followed by the church, the school, and finally the Sioux camp outside town. By dawn, the Dakota Territory will be at war. Swift Shadow caught Wolf, raised his eye, and nodded toward the window. The Sioux warrior understood immediately. He knocked his opponent unconscious with a powerful blow, then slipped out through the broken window to warn the settlement. It's over, Crawford, Swift Shadow called. Even if your men start fires, the people of Blackwood and the Sioux have moved beyond the hatred you're counting on. We'll see, Crawford replied. When they find Sioux arrows in the bodies of children, how forgiving will they be then? A movement near the desk caught Swift Shadow's attention. Eleanor had emerged from cover and was inching towards something on the floor, the revolver dropped by one of the fallen gunmen. Jessica saw her too. "Samuel!" she warned. Crawford spun and fired at Eleanor. Swift Shadow launched himself across the room, tackling her to the floor as the bullet whizzed overhead. In one fluid motion, he rolled to his feet and fired his last round at Crawford. The bullet struck Crawford in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. His gun clattered to the floor. Swift Shadow closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pressing the empty Winchester against Crawford's throat. "Give me a reason," he growled. Crawford, despite his wound, smiled coldly. "You won't kill an unarmed man. Your Sioux honor won't allow it." "He won't," came Eleanor's voice. "But I might." She stood holding the fallen revolver, its barrel pointed, steadily at Jessica, who had tried to reach her brother's dropped weapon. "Eleanor," the governor warned, emerging from behind the desk, "don't become what they are." Outside, more explosions illuminated the night. Shouts and gunfire echoed through the settlement. "It's already begun," Jessica gloated. "You've lost." The sound of pounding footsteps came from the hallway. Marshal Mason burst into the room, bleeding from a cut above his eye. "Governor, Crawford's men are attacking throughout town. They're dressed as Sioux warriors." He registered the scene before him with professional swiftness. "I see you found Crawford. His men are setting fires," Swift Shadow explained, "trying to make it look like a Sioux raid." "Not anymore," Mason replied grimly. "Wolf Eyes found me. We've captured 4 of them already. The rest are being hunted down." Crawford's face contorted with rage. "You can't stop what's coming. The territory will never accept peace with savages." "The only savage I see is you, Samuel," Eleanor said quietly, keeping the revolver trained on Jessica. Governor Harrington moved to the window, surveying the chaos. Below, fires burned in several buildings, but settlers and Sioux warriors were working together to extinguish them. Instead of fighting each other, they had united against a common enemy. "Look there, Crawford," the governor said. "That's the future of this territory, not your vision of hatred and greed." Marshal Mason handcuffed the wounded Crawford, then secured Jessica. "They'll face the territorial judge this time. No transfers, no chances to escape." As Crawford was led away, he fixed Swift Shadow with a venomous glare. "This isn't over, half-breed, not while I draw breath." "Then breathe carefully," Swift Shadow replied. When the Crawfords had been removed, Eleanor finally lowered the revolver, her hands beginning to tremble with delayed shock. Swift Shadow gently took the weapon from her fingers. "You did well," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I almost shot her, but you didn't." Governor Harrington joined them, placing an arm around his niece's shoulders. "Thanks to you both, Blackwood still stands, and more importantly, the peace holds." Through the window, they could see settlers and Sioux working side by side to contain the fires Crawford's men had started. What had been intended to divide them had instead demonstrated the strength of their newfound alliance. Later that night, after the fires had been extinguished and the settlement secured, Swift Shadow stood on the porch of the governor's mansion. The dark hours before dawn brought a stillness to Blackwood, broken only by the occasional sound of patrols passing in the streets. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the pre-dawn chill. She handed him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. "Wolf Eyes told me you were leaving," she said. Swift Shadow gazed out at the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightening of the sky promised a new day. "There's still Crawford's men to track. Some escaped in the confusion. And then He paused, considering. The ranger service you mentioned. It needs someone who knows the territory. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the Crawford incident. I was hoping you might say that. They stood in companionable silence as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops of Blackwood Settlement. Below, a Sioux hunting party rode out from their camp, nodding respectfully to the settler patrol they passed. Small gestures, Swift Shadow thought, but significant ones. You once told me no trail is ever truly cold, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Does that apply to the path forward as well? Swift Shadow considered her question. The future leaves no tracks to follow, he replied, but it can still be navigated by those who understand the land and its people. Eleanor's hand found his, a brief touch of connection. Stay for the Territorial Council meeting next week. My uncle values your perspective, as do I. Swift Shadow looked down at her. This young woman who had faced danger with courage and emerged stronger. In many ways, she reminded him of himself at a younger age, caught between two worlds, finding strength in both. I'll stay, he agreed. As the sun rose fully over the Dakota Territory, it illuminated a settlement forever changed. The governor's niece, once kidnapped to spark a war, now stood as a symbol of the peace that had unexpectedly flourished from her ordeal, and beside her, the legendary Sioux tracker had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for, a place to belong. The territory would face more challenges in the days ahead. Old hatreds and prejudices would not disappear overnight. But in that moment, as dawn broke over Blackwood Settlement, the future seemed full of possibility. I'll create part 4 of the story with 2,500 words as requested, continuing the narrative while avoiding repetitions to keep viewers engaged. I've created part 4 of the governor's niece story as requested, with approximately 2,500 words to help reach your 150-minute video duration goal. This section continues the narrative while avoiding repetition to maintain viewer engagement. In Part 4, I've developed new storylines and challenges. 6 months have passed, with Eleanor now working as the governor's representative to the joint. Ranger Service, Swift Shadow has become Chief Ranger of the Territorial Service. Samuel Crawford is found dead in his cell. Apparently murdered, Jessica Crawford emerges as a more dangerous antagonist with broader ambitions. A stagecoach attack serves as a diversion for Jessica's real plan. A poisoning attempt at the Territorial Council meeting reveals Jessica's new strategy. Eleanor demonstrates her growth by rallying the council after the poisoning attempt. The story concludes with the establishment of the Territorial Ranger Service and the ongoing challenge of maintaining peace. This final part creates a conclusion that resolves the immediate threat while setting up potential future conflicts. The character arcs show significant development, with Eleanor fully embracing her role in the territory and Swift Shadow finding purpose in the Ranger Service. Is there anything specific you'd like me to adjust or expand upon in this part of the story? Winter descended on the Dakota Territory with unforgiving swiftness. 3 months after the poisoning attempt at the council meeting, Blackwood Settlement lay blanketed in snow, the surrounding prairie transformed into a vast white wilderness. Inside, the newly constructed Ranger headquarters, a sturdy 2-story building at the edge of town, Swift Shadow stood before a large map pinned to the wall. Small flags marked reported sightings of Jessica Crawford and known locations of her growing movement. Another recruitment meeting here, he said, placing a new flag near the border with Montana Territory. 15 settlers attended, mainly disgruntled miners displaced by the new regulations. Eleanor Harrington made a notation in her ledger. As liaison between the governor's office and the Ranger Service, she attended all strategy sessions. Her position had raised eyebrows initially, a young woman involved in territorial security matters, but her intelligence and insight had quickly silenced critics. That's the third meeting this month, she observed. They're becoming bolder. Wolf Eyes, now Swift Shadow's second in command, studied the pattern of flags. They form a circle around the shared hunting grounds, like wolves surrounding prey. Marshal Mason entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Latest dispatch from Fort Lincoln," he announced, handing a sealed envelope to Swift Shadow. "Governor Harrington asked me to deliver it personally." Swift Shadow broke the seal and read the contents, his expression darkening. "The territorial governor is sending a special envoy to evaluate our joint governance arrangement. Apparently there have been concerns raised about its effectiveness." Eleanor frowned. "My uncle mentioned no such concerns." "That's because they didn't come from him," Mason said grimly. "Pressure is coming from Washington. Powerful mining interests want unrestricted access to the territory." "Jessica Crawford has friends in high places," Swift Shadow concluded. "This is her next move." Eleanor took the dispatch, scanning it quickly. "The envoy arrives in 2 weeks. Senator Walter Hammond." Mason let out a low whistle. "Hammond sits on the Committee for Western Territories. If he recommends dissolving the joint governance agreement..." "The peace ends," Wolf Eyes finished quietly. Swift Shadow turned back to the map, studying it with renewed intensity. "Jessica knows this territory almost as well as I do. She's out there somewhere, coordinating these recruitment meetings, building her movement." "We need to find her before the senator arrives," Eleanor said. "Show him concrete evidence of her activities." Mason shook his head doubtfully. "We've had patrols looking for months. She vanishes like smoke." "Because we've been reactive," Swift Shadow replied. "Following her trail after she's moved on. We need to anticipate her next location." He stepped closer to the map, examining the pattern of flags. "These 3 meetings form a line moving northward. If she continues the pattern..." Wolf Eyes nodded understanding. "Thunder Basin, the old trading settlement." "Abandoned since the plague 2 years ago," Mason added. "Good place to hide." Swift Shadow made his decision. "Wolf Eyes and I will scout. Thunder Basin. If she's there, we'll find her. Mason, keep the regular patrols running. We don't want to telegraph our suspicions." Eleanor closed her ledger with a decisive snap. "I'm coming with you." 3 sets of eyes turned to her in surprise. "That's not happening," Swift Shadow stated flatly. "Senator Hammond is coming at my uncle's invitation," Eleanor countered. "As his representative, I need to understand the full threat Jessica poses. Besides, I've been tracking the Dakota first. Movements, communications, I know what to look for." Mason coughed awkwardly. "Miss Harrington, it's 20 miles through the wilderness in the dead of winter, not to mention dangerous if Crawford's people are there." Eleanor's chin lifted in that stubborn way Swift Shadow had come to recognize. "I've spent a year in this territory. I'm not the same woman who arrived from Boston." Wolf Eyes, who had remained silent during the exchange, spoke unexpectedly. "She should come. The woman Crawford fears. It clouds her judgment when the governor's niece is involved." Swift Shadow held Eleanor's determined gaze for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "We leave at first light. Pack warm clothing, minimal provisions. We travel fast and light." As Eleanor departed to prepare, Mason gave Swift Shadow a concerned, "Look, the governor won't like this." "The governor isn't here," Swift Shadow replied. "And she's right. We need someone who understands the political implications of what we find." Dawn broke clear and cold, the temperature well below freezing as 3 riders departed Blackwood Settlement. They traveled northward along a frozen creek bed, their horses' breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Eleanor had surprised both men by appearing dressed in practical frontier garb, buckskin leggings beneath a heavy wool skirt, a fur-lined coat, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. She rode confidently, keeping pace without complaint despite the brutal cold. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack. Wolf-Eyes scouted ahead, while Swift Shadow built a small fire to warm their hands. "Your riding has improved," he commented as Eleanor stretched her stiff limbs. "I've been practicing," she replied. "Marshal Mason's wife has been teaching me frontier skills. She thinks every woman should know how to ride, shoot, and mend a wound. Wise woman, Mrs. Mason," Eleanor smiled. "She says I'm a natural with a rifle, better than most of the deputies." Swift Shadow raised an eyebrow. "That I'd like to see." "Hopefully. You won't need to," she said, suddenly serious. "But if it comes to it, I won't be a liability." Wolf-Eyes returned, his expression cautious. "Tracks ahead. 3 riders passed yesterday, heading toward Thunder Basin. They doused the fire and continued north. By late afternoon, the abandoned settlement came into view. A collection of weathered buildings, half buried in snowdrifts, nestled in a natural basin, surrounded by pine-covered hills. From their vantage point on the ridge, Swift Shadow studied the seemingly deserted town through a spyglass. "Smoke from the old trading post chimney," he reported. "Very faint. They're being careful." "How many?" Eleanor asked. "Can't tell. We'll need to get closer after dark." They retreated into the pine forest to make camp and wait for nightfall. As Wolf-Eyes prepared a cold supper of pemmican and dried berries, Eleanor removed a small leather-bound notebook from her saddlebag. "I've been cataloguing what we know about Jessica's movement," she explained, opening it to reveal pages of neat handwriting. "Their rhetoric focuses on 3 themes: settler primacy, resource control, and resistance to federal oversight." Swift Shadow examined the notebook with interest. "You've been thorough." "Know your enemy," Eleanor replied. "Jessica is building something more dangerous than her brother ever envisioned. Samuel wanted wealth and power. She wants ideological change, a Dakota territory where settlers rule absolutely and the Sioux are removed or subjugated." Wolf-Eyes joined them, his face solemn in the fading light. "Many of my people feared this was the true aim of all settlers." "Not all," Eleanor said firmly. "Most want the peace to hold. But peace requires continuous effort," Swift Shadow observed. "Conflict requires only a spark." As darkness descended, they prepared to approach Thunder Basin. Eleanor tucked her notebook away and checked the revolver at her belt, a gesture that didn't escape Swift Shadow's notice. "Stay between us," he instructed. "If trouble comes, find cover immediately." They left their horses secured in the pine grove and descended toward the settlement on foot, moving silently through knee-deep snow. The abandoned buildings loomed, like ghosts in the moonlight, windows dark and empty except for the trading post at the center of town. There, behind heavy curtains, the faintest glow of lamplight was visible. Swift Shadow signaled for them to circle around to the rear of the building. A single horse was tethered in a lean-to shed, steam rising from its back. Only one rider then, not the 3 they had tracked. "A messenger?" Eleanor whispered. "Perhaps," Swift Shadow replied. "Or bait for a trap." Wolf-Eyes pointed to fresh footprints leading from the shed to the trading post's back door. "One person arrived within the hour." They crept closer, hugging the shadows. Swift Shadow led them to a small window at the rear of the building, its glass clouded with years of grime. Carefully wiping a small section clear, he peered inside. Woman sat at a table, writing by lamplight. Her red hair was pulled back severely, her expression intent on the document before her. Jessica Crawford. Swift Shadow gestured for Eleanor and Wolf-Eyes to look. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the woman who had orchestrated her kidnapping and nearly destroyed the territory's fragile peace. "She's alone," Wolf-Eyes confirmed after studying the room's interior. "That makes no sense," Eleanor whispered. "Why would she come here without protection?" Swift Shadow's instincts prickled with warning. "Because she's meeting someone she doesn't want her own people to know about." A sound from the front of the trading post confirmed his suspicion, the crunch of approaching footsteps in snow, multiple sets. Swift Shadow pulled Eleanor and Wolf Eyes away from the window, retreating to the shadows behind a collapsed storage shed. Moments later, the trading post's front door opened, spilling lamplight onto the snow-covered ground. 3 figures entered, men in expensive Eastern clothing, distinctly out of place in the abandoned frontier settlement. The door closed behind them, plunging the street back into darkness. "Did you recognize them?" Swift Shadow asked Eleanor. She shook her head. "Not clearly, but their attire suggests government officials or corporate representatives. We need to hear what they're discussing," Wolf Eyes said. Swift Shadow considered their options. The trading post had a cellar accessible through exterior doors. If they hadn't been completely buried by snow, that cellar would have ventilation. "To the main floor, enough perhaps to overhear conversations." "This way," he whispered, leading them around the building. They found the cellar doors partially obscured by a snowdrift. Working silently, they cleared enough snow to pull one door open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Swift Shadow went first, checking for rotted steps or other hazards. The cellar was cold but dry, lined with empty shelves that had once held the trading post's supplies. Above them, floorboards creaked as people moved about the main room. Positioning themselves beneath what appeared to be the central table, they could make out voices, muffled but intelligible through gaps in the aging floorboards. "Assure you, Senator, the situation is more volatile than Governor Harrington admits," Jessica's distinctive voice. "The Sioux violation of hunting boundaries last month was deliberately concealed from territorial authorities." A man's voice responded, deep and authoritative. "Serious allegations, Miss Crawford, yet the ranger reports show declining incidents." "Overall, reports can be manipulated," Jessica replied smoothly. "My sources within the settlement confirm growing resentment among the miners and farmers. They see the joint governance as favoring Sioux interests at the expense of development." Another male voice joined the conversation. "The mining consortium has significant investments planned for the region. The current restrictions make those developments untenable." "Precisely my point," Jessica said. "The territory's economic future is being strangled by misguided idealism. The Sioux have their reserved lands. The shared hunting grounds should be opened to proper development. And what of Chief Red Hawk's claim that the watersheds would be poisoned by unrestricted mining?" asked the first man, presumably Senator Hammond. "Primitive superstition," Jessica dismissed. "Modern mining techniques pose minimal environmental impact." Eleanor's face tightened with anger at the blatant lie. Swift Shadow placed a warning hand on her arm. The conversation continued above them, detailing Jessica's proposal for dissolving the joint governance agreement in favor of unified territorial administration, a thinly veiled plan to exclude Sioux from any meaningful participation in the territory's future. "I'll need more than your word, Miss Crawford," Senator Hammond said finally. "I require concrete evidence of this arrangement's failure before I can recommend changes to Washington." "You'll have it," Jessica promised. "When you tour the territory next week, you'll see the discontent firsthand, particularly at the new silver mine near Blackwater Ridge." The third man spoke again. "The consortium is prepared to offer significant infrastructure investment once the regulatory obstacles are removed. Railways, telegraph lines, modern amenities that would transform this backwater into a proper American territory." "A compelling vision," Hammond acknowledged, "though Governor Harrington will resist changes to the current arrangement." Jessica's voice took on a harder edge. "Governors can be replaced, Senator, especially those who prioritize savage interests over progress." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with arrangements made for further communication through intermediaries. In Blackwood, the 3 visitors departed first, leaving Jessica alone in the trading post. In the cellar, Swift Shadow signaled for them to exit the way they had come. Once safely away from the settlement, Eleanor finally gave voice to her outrage. She's trying to dismantle everything we've built, and those men, they're willing to destroy the peace for mining profits." The man with Hammond was Theodore Blackwell, Swift Shadow said quietly. "Director of the Western Mining Consortium. I recognized his voice from when he visited Crawford's operation last year." Wolf Eyes had been unusually silent. Now he spoke, his voice heavy with concern. "She mentioned Blackwater Ridge. My cousin's hunting party reported strange activities there 3 days ago. Men with surveying equipment, armed guards. They're already moving forward with their plans," Eleanor realized, "creating facts on the ground before Hammond's official visit." Swift Shadow nodded grimly. "We need to see what's happening at Blackwater Ridge, and we need to warn my uncle," Eleanor added. "Hammond's visit isn't a fact-finding mission. It's political theater orchestrated by Jessica. They made camp in the pine forest, far enough from Thunder Basin to avoid detection but close, enough to observe any departures." Wolf Eyes took the first watch, while Eleanor and Swift Shadow huddled near their small concealed fire. "Will you arrest her?" Eleanor asked, nodding toward the distant settlement where Jessica remained. Swift Shadow shook his head. "Not yet. She'd claim political persecution, which would only strengthen her position with Hammond. We need evidence of illegal activity, not just objectionable opinions." "Blackwater Ridge," Eleanor mused. "That's within the shared territory, isn't it? Any mining operation there would require joint council approval." "Approval they don't have," Swift Shadow confirmed. "If they're conducting unauthorized mining or even preparatory work, that's a clear violation we can document for Hammond." Eleanor wrapped her blanket tighter against the bitter cold. "Jessica has been 3 steps ahead of us from the beginning. First the kidnapping, then the poisoning attempt, now this political maneuvering. She's intelligent and determined," Swift Shadow acknowledged, "but she makes mistakes. Her hatred blinds her to possibilities beyond conflict." "Like what we've built in Blackwood?" Eleanor asked. "A community where different peoples find common ground." Swift Shadow nodded, stoking the small fire. "The Ranger Service alone proves her worldview wrong. Sioux and settlers working together, protecting all people of the territory." Eleanor studied him in the flickering firelight, this man of 2 worlds who had become the embodiment of what the territory could be. Over the past year, she had come to admire him deeply, though neither had put words to the connection between them. "When I first arrived in Dakota," she said quietly, "I thought I'd be counting the days until I could return east. Now I can't imagine leaving." "The frontier changes people," Swift Shadow replied, "sometimes for the better." "It's not just the frontier," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes directly. "It's the people, what they stand for, what they fight to protect." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Wolf Eyes returned to the fire, breaking the spell. "Jessica Crawford leaves," he reported. "Riding north, not south toward Blackwood." Swift Shadow rose immediately. "We follow at first light. Now we should rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Dawn revealed a changed landscape. Snow had fallen heavily during the night, covering their tracks and blanketing the world in pristine white. Wolf Eyes, despite the difficult conditions, had no trouble following Jessica's trail northward. "She rides with purpose," he observed, "not trying to hide her path." By mid-morning, they understood why. Jessica's trail led directly to Blackwater Ridge, a prominent elevation overlooking one of the territory's most fertile hunting valleys. As they approached, the sounds of activity carried through the clear winter air. The rhythmic clang of metal on stone, men's voices calling instructions, the rumble of heavy equipment. From the cover of a pine grove, they observed an operation that defied belief. In the short span of weeks since the poisoning attempt, a substantial mining camp had been established on the ridge. At least 30 men worked around a mine entrance with wooden structures already constructed to house equipment and personnel. "How is this possible?" Eleanor whispered in shock. The Joint Council never approved any development here. Swift Shadow's expression hardened as he surveyed the illegal operation. This wasn't built overnight. Jessica has been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Wolf Eyes pointed to a figure directing workers near the mine entrance, Jessica Crawford, and the men from Thunder Basin. Through Swift Shadow's spyglass, Eleanor could clearly see Jessica conferring with Senator Hammond and Theodore Blackwell. The men appeared impressed by the operation, nodding approvingly as Jessica gestured toward various aspects of the camp. They're manufacturing a success story, Eleanor realized. When Hammond reports back to Washington, he'll describe a thriving enterprise bringing prosperity to the territory, conveniently omitting that it violates every agreement we've established. We need evidence, Swift Shadow said decisively. Documented proof of what they're doing here. Eleanor pulled out her notebook and began sketching the camp's layout, making detailed notes about its size, activities, and the presence of political figures. Wolf Eyes disappeared briefly, returning with a small cloth bag. Water from the stream below the ridge, he said grimly, already cloudy with mining waste. Swift Shadow took the bag, securing it inside his coat. This, combined with your documentation, gives us something concrete to present to the governor and the Joint Council. As they watched, Jessica led her distinguished visitors into the main building, presumably for further discussions away from the cold. Workers continued their tasks, unaware of the observers in the nearby forest. We've seen enough, Swift Shadow decided. We need to return to Blackwood immediately. Hammond will likely head there directly from here, and we must be prepared. They retreated carefully, leaving no trace of their presence. Once safely away from the mining camp, they mounted their horses and set a fast pace southward, taking a more direct route than their journey out. Eleanor rode alongside Swift Shadow, her mind racing with implications. Jessica isn't just seeking revenge anymore, she said. She's attempting a complete takeover of the territory's governance. Using Washington's authority to override local agreements, Swift Shadow agreed. If Hammond endorses her vision, the Joint Council could be dissolved by federal mandate. Then we must ensure he sees the full picture, Eleanor replied with determination, not just Jessica's carefully constructed narrative. As they rode through the winter landscape, the fate of the Dakota Territory hung in the balance. The peace that had been so painstakingly built, the cooperation that had begun to heal ancient wounds, all threatened by ambition and greed, disguised as progress. Yet in the faces of the three riders racing toward Blackwood, there was no defeat, only resolve. The governor's niece, once kidnapped to spark a war, now rode to prevent a different kind of conflict, one fought with political weapons, but potentially just as devastating. The legendary Sioux tracker who had found her trail when it was 3 days cold now followed a different path, one leading not just to justice for a single crime, but to a future where justice might extend to all people of the territory. Behind them, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. Ahead lay Blackwood settlement and the next chapter in the struggle for the soul of the Dakota Territory. Blackwood settlement was abuzz with activity when Swift Shadow, Eleanor, and Wolf Eyes returned. Senator Hammond had arrived the previous evening, welcomed with a formal reception at the governor's mansion. The town had been decorated with flags and bunting, creating a carefully cultivated impression of frontier prosperity. "My uncle doesn't know what we're facing," Eleanor said, as they rode down the main street. Townsfolk nodded respectfully to Swift Shadow in his ranger uniform, though many eyed Wolf Eyes with lingering suspicion. Hammond has already formed his impressions based on whatever Jessica told him. "Then we change those impressions," Swift Shadow replied, guiding his horse toward Ranger headquarters. Inside, they found Marshal Mason coordinating security for the senator's visit. He looked up in surprise as they entered, snow still melting from their winter gear. "You're back sooner than expected," he observed. "Find anything at Thunder Basin?" "More than we anticipated," Swift Shadow answered grimly. "Where's the senator now?" "Taking a guided tour of the settlement with the governor. They're scheduled to meet with the Joint Council this afternoon." Mason studied their serious expressions. "What happened out there?" Eleanor quickly recounted. Their discoveries, Jessica's meeting with Hammond and Blackwell, the illegal mining operation at Blackwater Ridge, and the clear conspiracy to undermine the joint governance agreement. "Damn," Mason muttered. "The governor needs to know immediately." "I'll brief him," Eleanor said, already removing her heavy coat. "Swift Shadow, you should present our findings to the Joint Council when they convene. Coming from the Chief Ranger, they'll carry more weight." Swift Shadow nodded agreement. "Wolf Eyes, take the water sample to Benjamin Harris at the assayer's office. He can verify the contamination scientifically." As they dispersed to their tasks, Swift Shadow took a moment to study the map on the headquarters wall. The flags marking Jessica's activities now formed a clear pattern, a noose tightening around the shared territories. How had they missed it before? Governor Harrington was visibly shaken by Eleanor's report. They stood in his private study while Senator Hammond was entertained elsewhere in the mansion by territorial officials. An entire mining operation established without council approval, he repeated incredulously. "How could this happen without our knowledge?" "Jessica Crawford has been planning this for months," Eleanor explained. "The poisoning attempt, the stagecoach attack, all diversions to keep us looking elsewhere while she built her case for federal intervention." The governor paced before the fireplace. "Hammond has been hinting at necessary adjustments to our governance structure since he arrived. Now I understand why. He's being manipulated," Eleanor insisted. "Jessica is showing him only what supports her narrative of ineffective joint governance. Then we must present the complete picture," her uncle decided. "The council meeting is in 2 hours. I want you there, Eleanor. Your documentation of the illegal mine could be crucial." "Swift Shadow is preparing to present our findings," she confirmed. "But, Uncle, we need to tread carefully. Accusing a U.S. senator of conspiracy could backfire disastrously." "Not an accusation," the governor clarified. "Education. Hammond needs to understand what's truly at stake here, not just mining rights or territorial politics, but a model for peaceful coexistence that could shape the future of Western expansion." The town hall had been prepared for the joint council meeting with extra care. The territorial flag and the U.S. flag hung behind the main table, while representatives from both settler communities and Sioux bands occupied their designated seats. Senator Hammond sat in a place of honor beside Governor Harrington, his distinguished appearance and Eastern attire standing out among the frontier clothing of most council members. Chief Red Hawk occupied the co-chair position, his dignity bearing, a match for the senator's political gravitas. Swift Shadow entered with Eleanor and Wolf Eyes, all three still showing signs of their hard journey. They took positions at the side of the room as the meeting was called to order. "Distinguished representatives, honored guests," Governor Harrington began. "Today we conduct our regular business with the additional privilege of demonstrating to Senator Hammond how our joint governance serves the Dakota Territory. Before we proceed with standard matters, however, an urgent issue has arisen that requires council attention." He nodded to Swift Shadow, who stepped forward. The room fell, silent. The Chief Ranger rarely addressed the full council. "Yesterday," Swift Shadow began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hall, "a ranger patrol discovered an unauthorized mining operation at Blackwater Ridge within the shared territories." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. Swift Shadow continued, recounting their observations with precise detail, carefully omitting any mention of Jessica Crawford or Senator Hammond's presence at the site. Instead, he focused on the facts, the size of the operation, its environmental impact, and its clear violation of council authority. Eleanor followed, presenting her documentation and sketches, which were distributed to council members. The stream below the ridge already shows signs of contamination, she explained, as Wolf Eyes produced the water sample and Benjamin Harris confirmed its analysis. If mining continues unchecked, the watershed feeding both settler farms and Sioux hunting grounds will be poisoned within months. Senator Hammond shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence visibly eroding. Governor Harrington watched him closely, while maintaining an expression of appropriate concern about the revelations. Chief Red Hawk spoke next. This violation threatens the core of our agreement, that decisions affecting the shared lands must be made together, with respect for the earth that sustains us all. The council erupted in debate. Settler representatives expressed outrage at the circumvention of proper protocols, while Sioux leaders voiced concern about the environmental damage. Through it all, Hammond remained notably silent, observing the passionate but orderly discussion with increasing interest. As the initial furor subsided, the governor addressed the senator directly. "You see before you the strength of our arrangement, Senator Hammond. When problems arise, we address them together, bringing different perspectives to find balanced solutions." Hammond cleared his throat. "A commendable process, Governor, though some in Washington question whether such collaborative governance slows necessary development of territorial resources. Development at the expense of poisoned water and broken agreements is no path to prosperity," Chief Red Hawk responded with quiet authority. Eleanor stepped forward again. "Senator, if I may." At the governor's nod, she continued, "The Ranger Service has prepared a comprehensive report comparing incidence rates before and after joint governance implementation. Violence between communities has decreased by 67%. Trade has increased by 40%. These aren't idealistic claims, they're measurable outcomes." Swift Shadow added, "The unauthorized mine represents an attempt to bypass this successful system, not evidence of its failure." Hammond studied them thoughtfully. "Your passion is evident. But I've received reports of widespread settler dissatisfaction with the current arrangements, particularly regarding development restrictions." "I wonder," Governor Harrington said carefully, "if the source of those reports might have a personal interest in portraying dissatisfaction where little exists." Before Hammond could respond, the town hall doors burst open. Jessica Crawford strode in, followed by Theodore Blackwell and several well-dressed men. Her expression registered momentary surprise at seeing Swift Shadow and Eleanor, quickly masked by cool confidence. "Forgive my interruption," she announced, "but I believe the senator would benefit from hearing alternative perspectives on the territory's governance." Governor Harrington rose from his seat. "Miss Crawford, this is a closed council session." "A session discussing my mining operation," she replied smoothly. "Surely I deserve the opportunity to address these allegations." Swift Shadow exchanged glances with Eleanor. Jessica's appearance was unexpected, but potentially useful. She had just publicly claimed ownership of the illegal mine. Senator Hammond studied Jessica with newfound wariness. "Miss Crawford, you acknowledge establishing the Blackwater Ridge mine without council approval?" Jessica smiled confidently. "The mine operates under federal mineral rights granted to the Western Mining Consortium. Territorial restrictions are secondary to national interests." Chief Red Hawk's expression darkened. "Treaties with my people were signed by your government. Are these national promises also secondary?" Blackwell stepped forward. "The consortium has invested considerable capital in developing Dakota's resources. The Joint Council's excessive restrictions threaten America's industrial growth." The room tensed as council members absorbed the implications. This was no longer about a single unauthorized mine, but a direct challenge to the territory's right to govern itself. Governor Harrington maintained his composure. Senator Hammond, it appears we face a fundamental question. Does Washington recognize the authority of the governance structure it approved just 1 year ago? Or can private interests with political connections simply ignore local authority? The senator looked uncomfortable, caught between territorial rights and powerful Eastern mining interests. This is precisely the conflict I was sent to evaluate. Eleanor seized the moment. Then evaluate it based on facts, Senator, not manufactured grievances. She opened her notebook to a new page. We've documented 7 instances where Miss Crawford or her associates have deliberately created incidents to undermine faith in joint governance. Jessica's confident expression faltered slightly. Baseless accusations from a girl with a personal vendetta. Not baseless, Swift Shadow contradicted, nodding to Marshal Mason, who produced a leather folder. Sworn statements from the woman, who administered poison at the council meeting 3 months ago, Mason explained. She identified Jessica Crawford as her employer and detailed the plan to create conflict between communities. Jessica's eyes darted toward the exits, where deputies now stood alert. This is absurd. Senator Hammond, surely you recognize a desperate attempt to discredit legitimate business interests. The senator studied Jessica thoughtfully. What I recognize, Miss Crawford, is that you failed to disclose certain relevant information during our discussions, particularly your previous involvement in criminal activities against the governor's niece. A tense silence fell over the hall. Jessica's composure cracked further, her true nature emerging as she realized her careful plans were unraveling. These savages have no right to block progress, she hissed, gesturing toward the Sioux council members. My brother understood that. The territory belongs to those who can use it properly, not primitive hunters clinging to the past. Chief Red Hawk remained dignified despite the insult. The past teaches us to preserve what sustains life. Your progress poisons the water and destroys the land that feeds both our peoples. Theodore Blackwell, sensing the shifting mood, attempted to distance himself from Jessica. The consortium was unaware of any illegal actions. We were assured all proper permissions had been secured. Jessica turned on him with venomous rage. Coward! You knew exactly what was happening. You provided the financing, the equipment, the political connections. As Jessica's conspirators began to turn on each other, Marshal Mason moved to intervene. Miss Crawford, you're under arrest for conspiracy, illegal mining operations, and attempted sabotage of territorial governance. Jessica backed away, her hand moving to her coat pocket. I will not be stopped by backward territorialism. Swift Shadow saw the gleam of metal as she withdrew a small derringer. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, deflecting her arm upward as the weapon discharged. The bullet splintered the ceiling beam as deputies swarmed forward, disarming Jessica and securing her wrists. This changes nothing, she shouted as she was led away. The territory will industrialize with or without your precious agreement. In the stunned silence that followed, Senator Hammond rose to his feet. Governor Harrington, Chief Red Hawk, distinguished council members, I believe I've seen enough to form my evaluation. All eyes turned to the senator, whose decision would shape the territory's future. When I arrived, Hammond continued, I harbored serious doubts about the viability of joint governance between such different peoples. My preliminary conversations with certain interests, he glanced toward Blackwell, who looked distinctly uncomfortable, reinforced those doubts. The senator paused, surveying the chamber. But what I've witnessed today is remarkable. Not perfect harmony, certainly, but a genuine commitment to resolving differences through reason rather than force. The passion with which both settlers and Sioux defend your shared governance speaks volumes. Relief spread visibly through the chamber as Hammond continued, My report to Washington will recommend continued support for the current arrangement, with additional federal resources for the ranger service that so effectively bridges your communities." The council erupted in applause. Governor Harrington extended his hand to Chief Redhawk, who clasped it firmly in the gesture that had become symbolic of their unprecedented alliance. As the formal proceedings concluded, Eleanor found Swift Shadow near the door, preparing to depart. "You're not staying for the celebration?" she asked. "There's still work to be done," he replied. "The Blackwater mine needs to be properly shut down. The watershed is protected." Eleanor nodded, understanding. Always the ranger, looking to the next task. A rare smile touched his features. "Someone once told me no trail is ever truly cold, and no path forward is ever completely clear," she added, echoing their conversation months earlier. "But it can be navigated by those who understand the land and its people." Swift Shadow studied her face, noting how the past year had transformed the sheltered Boston girl into a woman of remarkable strength and insight. "You understand this land now, better than many born to it?" "I had good teachers," she replied, holding his gaze. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken depth. Then Wolf Eyes appeared, tactfully clearing his throat. "The Rangers await instructions regarding the mine," he reported. Swift Shadow nodded, turning to go. "I'll return for the governor's reception tomorrow. I'll hold you to that," Eleanor called after him. As Swift Shadow departed with Wolf Eyes, Eleanor watched them go with quiet satisfaction. The crisis had been averted, Jessica Crawford's schemes exposed and defeated, yet she harbored no illusions that the struggle for the territory's soul was over. There would be other challenges, other forces seeking to disrupt the fragile peace they had built. The path forward would never be simple or straightforward. But looking around at the diverse gathering, settlers and Sioux, united in common purpose despite their differences, Eleanor felt a profound certainty that they were creating something uniquely valuable. The following evening, the governor's reception for Senator Hammond filled the mansion with distinguished guests from both communities. Eleanor, dressed in a gown that blended Eastern style with frontier practicality, found herself repeatedly thanked by council members for her role in exposing the conspiracy. "You've become quite the territorial diplomat," her uncle observed proudly. "A far cry from the reluctant visitor who arrived last spring." Eleanor smiled. "The territory changes people." "Some more than others," the governor agreed, nodding toward the entrance where Swift Shadow had just arrived. The chief ranger looked distinctly uncomfortable in formal attire, though he wore it with the same quiet dignity that characterized everything he did. Seeing Eleanor, he made his way through the crowded room to her side. "The Blackwater mine has been secured," he reported. "The consortium engineers are cooperating with Sioux waterkeepers to prevent further contamination." "Always business first," she teased gently. "Not always," he countered, surprising her. "I heard music from the reception. I thought perhaps you might favor a dance?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't know Sioux trackers danced." "There are many things you still don't know about me, Eleanor Harrington," he replied with unexpected warmth. As they moved to the area cleared for dancing, Eleanor noted the curious glances from other guests. A Boston-bred governor's niece and a half-Sioux ranger made an unconventional pair, crossing boundaries of culture and background that had once seemed impenetrable. Yet in their partnership, forged through danger, strengthened by shared purpose, lay the very essence of what made the Dakota Territory experiment so revolutionary. Different worlds meet not in conflict but in cooperation, finding in their differences complementary strengths rather than reasons for division. "Senator Hammond leaves tomorrow," Eleanor mentioned as they danced. "He's invited me to correspond about our governance model. He believes other territories might benefit from studying our approach." Swift Shadow nodded thoughtfully. "What begins in Dakota could spread. A different kind of future for the West." "A better one," she affirmed, "though Jessica Crawford won't be the last to resist it." "No," he agreed. There will always be those who profit from division and conflict. The music ended, and they moved toward the doors leading to the mansion's porch. Outside, the night sky blazed with stars, their light reflecting off the snow-covered landscape. "I received a letter from my parents today," Eleanor said after a comfortable silence. "They've requested I return to Boston this spring." Swift Shadow kept his expression neutral. "Will you go?" She turned to face him directly. "I've already replied. My place is here, helping build what we've started. The territory is my home now." Something shifted in Swift Shadow's eyes, a guarded hope carefully revealed. "The Ranger Service is expanding," he said. "We need someone to coordinate between the governor's office and the field units, someone who understands both worlds." You offering me a position, Chief Ranger Blackwood?" she asked with a smile. "I'm suggesting a partnership," he replied simply. Eleanor understood the layers of meaning in his words. In the Dakota Territory of 1878, conventions were being rewritten, new possibilities emerging where none had existed before. What might have seemed impossible in Boston was, here on the frontier, simply the next logical step in their shared journey. "I accept," she said quietly. As winter stars blazed overhead, the governor's niece and the legendary Sioux tracker stood together at the crossroads of a changing territory. The path forward would not be easy. Prejudices ran deep, old wounds healed slowly, and powerful interests would continue to threaten their vision. But in that moment, as their hands found each other in the starlight, the future seemed filled with possibility. The young woman who had been kidnapped during a territory dispute, and the tracker who had found her trail when it was 3 days cold, had discovered something neither had expected. A common vision worth fighting for, and perhaps something more profound between them. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued in the governor's mansion. Before them stretched the vast Dakota landscape, transforming under winter's touch, but enduring in its essential nature. Like the territory itself, they stood at the intersection of preservation and progress, finding in that delicate balance the promise of a new beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.